So let's start. We are here with Bram Desmet, the CEO and General Manager from Flanders Scientifics. Thank you so much, Bram, for
Yeah,
staying here.
yeah,
And we are
absolutely.
going to talk about, we will explore actually the benefits of a 3000 nits capable mastering display, in this case, the FSI XM310K. So
Yep.
welcome everybody and welcome, Bram. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And you're in.
All right. Great. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. I am Bram Desmet with Flanders Scientific. I'm going to start sharing my screen here in a second because I've got some graphics that I think will be helpful here. And we're joined by Brian Gordon, who's our marketing manager. He'll be just monitoring the chat. And if you have any questions, you can drop them there in the chat, and he'll kind of point those out to me near the end, and I'll try to get to those. This should probably run me about 18 or 19 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and dive into that so that we can have time for questions. So let me
Yes, we are going
share
to
my
give
screen.
prizes. Yeah,
Yes,
so
and
stay
then there's
tuned.
yeah, absolutely. So that's a great point. We will have a quiz at the end, and we'll be giving away $1,000 gift certificate, good towards anything we sell on our store. So let me get this going, and we should be good there. So I think everybody can see my screen now, right?
Yes,
And
we
we're gonna
said.
get started.
Yeah.
All right.
It's,
Great. So I'm going to go ahead here. So I'd like to start with some context to kind of frame our discussion. So as many of you probably already undoubtedly know, Flanders Scientific has both a 1000 nit capable 31-inch HDR mastering monitor. That's the XM311K. We also have a 3000 nit capable 31-inch HDR mastering monitor. That's the XM310K. Having both in our lineup, each with their own pros and cons, provides us with what I think is a fairly unique perspective on this topic of monitoring beyond 1000 nits. This topic normally comes up in our day-to-day discussions with people in the industry as a question, and that question is 1000 nits enough? And the answer to that question is, of course, well, frankly, it depends. Strictly speaking, most companies requesting HDR content are requiring 1000 nit deliverables as a minimum threshold. So, in that sense, you could think of 1000 nits being enough. However, many of these same companies will accept deliverables mastered beyond 1000 nits. And in a slowly growing percent of those cases, we're seeing them actually request over 1000 nits for some of their premier content. Of course, I don't think any of us would be surprised that a company that only sells 1000 nit monitors would probably tell you that 1000 is plenty. But let's try to take a little bit more balanced of a look at that since we do carry both. So let's dive in. What does a 3000 nit display actually do for us compared to a 1000 nit display? I think for a lot of people, this question conjures up images of small, sparkly bits of white light being considerably brighter, and well, that's at least in part certainly true. But from an engineering, QC, and future proofing standpoint, another way to look at this is the expanded code value range coverage offered by such a display. So PQ is a absolute standard. Sorry, and each code value has a specific corresponding luminance. There's a new handy little iOS app made by my friend David Abrams at Avocal that provides a very easy way to calculate these differences with respect to grayscale response and PQ. So that's what we have up here now. So as you can see here, a traditional 100 nit SDR luminance range has over half of all code values attributed to it in PQ. The next 25% of code values takes us from 100 nits to 1000 nits. So with a 1000 nit display, we can represent about 75% of PQ code values on screen. But going to a 3000 nit display gives us coverage of 87% of PQ code values. If you were to jump beyond this, say to a 4000 nit display, you could then represent 90% of the PQ code values. However, focusing on just these grayscale values misses a much broader point. You may be familiar with something called the Hunt effect, which is in essence describes a visual phenomena whereby any fixed chromaticity, or you may want to think of that as any fixed combination of hue and saturation, appears more colorful as you increase its luminance. Our simulated example here is definitely a bit crude because we're presenting an SDR, of course, but it attempts to convey how just changing luminance from SDR to something tenfold brighter like 1000 nits HDR to then something 30 times brighter like 3000 nits HDR has an impact on perceived colorfulness despite there being no changes to the actual chromaticity of the colors in question. Colorists comparing the 3000 nit XM310K to the 1000 nit XM311K often comment to us that the XM310K appears to be capable of a wider color gamut. But the gamut of these units is essentially identical. What is being noted by these users is instead the ability to produce increased perceived colorfulness. One way to quantify and visualize these differences in display capability is by viewing them as a 3D color volume. So pictured here as a base reference, we have a very common configuration for the XM310K, and that is a 3000 nit PQ gamut color, or PQ EOTF P3 gamut color volume. Next, we can see where the traditional 100 nit SDR luminance value range lies within this 3000 nit color volume. Keep in mind that what is shown here is actually also a P3 gamut 100 nit portion of this color volume. If we were to compare how a smaller Rec 709 gamut fits inside of our chosen reference gamut, the color volume pictured here would be even smaller. Then we can take a look at the 1000 nit portion of this color volume. We can see just how much the available color volume expands, going from 100 nits to 1000 nits. The color volume the colorist has to work with is substantially larger, giving them the ability not only to convey brighter highlights, but also perceptually more colorful imagery. And of course, a 3000 nit display provides an even larger color volume, allowing for still more colorful, lifelike, and compelling imagery to be created. Now, of course, you don't have to take advantage of larger color volume or feel bound to overcooking your footage just because you can. But generally speaking, we find that content creators appreciate having a wider color palette available to them to explore an increased amount of creative possibilities. There are a few other sometimes overlooked considerations when comparing 1000 nit versus higher luminance displays. A simple issue to start with is that many ostensibly 1000 nit rated displays are only really aspirationally 1000 nits. It is not uncommon to find that units that are marketed as 1000 nits produce peak output that is actually a good bit below 1000 nits. And for units that can actually hit around 1000 nits when new, maintaining these levels with aging can still be quite difficult. Even if you're grading primarily at 1000 nits, having a 3000 nit plus capable display provides much more headroom. In the case of our own XM310K, the 3000 nit rating is actually fairly conservative. New units may hit over 3400 nits, providing not just headroom to 1000 nits, but also headroom to 3000 nits. Another consideration is loading behavior. This is not a concern with all 1000 nit displays. Light modulating cell layer, for example, doesn't suffer from this. But some other technologies like OLED, the 1000 nit rating on those is very commonly for just 1 to 10% of screen area. This means that scenes with high average picture level may induce significant loading behavior, causing screen dimming from reference levels. Displays like the XM310K allow for very high full screen average picture levels, so 500 or even 1000 nits full screen is no issue, with plenty of headroom to spare for highlights well beyond 1000 nits. Pictured as an example of what this loading behavior functionally looks like. If we display a small white square against a black background on screen with our display set up to PQ and receiving a code value that should give us 1000 nit output on screen, both the OLED and XM310K can get the job done. However, if we want to show the same exact code value full screen, the XM310K has no issue maintaining the target 1000 nit luminance, but the OLED display only gives us a couple hundred nits of output. I'm certainly not going to argue that we should all be aiming for exceptionally high average picture levels with all of our content. To the contrary, I'm an advocate for trying to keep average picture levels more reasonable most of the time. But creatively, there are certainly instances where an average picture level of several hundred nits is a useful storytelling mechanism. So inherently limiting that so drastically as a function just of display limitations is less than ideal. So now that we've reviewed some of the benefits of monitoring beyond 1000 nits, you may be asking yourself, well, what's the catch? Why not always just get the brightest display you can afford? Indeed, you may be thinking back to when I started the presentation and wondering why FSI would bother to carry both a 1000 nit display and a 3000 nit display. You might be guessing that 1000 nit displays are bound to be less expensive. but that isn't actually necessarily always the case. In our own lineup, our 1000 nit display is actually more expensive than our 3000 nit display. So what gives? To answer that question, we first need to look at what it takes to go beyond 1000 nits. We have some of the most prevalent current display technologies listed here, and we'll take a look at their feasibility for getting us beyond 1000 nits. Let's start with OLED. We see two basic types of OLED displays out there, RGB OLED and WRGB OLEDs, also called WOLEDs, or what a lot of you probably just call the LG panels. The vast majority of previous and current RGB OLEDs were really only rated for SDR use. There have been a handful of legitimate professional grade HDR RGB OLED panels in the past, but those are largely going away. They are expensive to make, they suffer from burn-in, and the significant loading behavior in HDR use, and even over small areas, they suffer from significant loading behavior even in HDR use, and even over small areas can just marginally get to 1000 nits. Even if we had not seen the large-scale exit of RGB OLEDs from the professional monitor market, getting such devices to advance beyond 1000 nits would have been extremely difficult at a technological level. Discounting any major advancements in the technology, I personally wouldn't expect to see RGB OLED as a feasible HDR monitoring technology going forward for our industry. However, if it sounds like I'm hedging just a bit there, the reason is because on the smaller scale, think phones here, OLED technology has done some fairly impressive things as of late, but my money is still on that not scaling significantly to the sizes you all are likely interested in. WOLEDs, on the other hand, are clearly there in sizes of interest to us. And in the consumer or even client monitoring spaces, these are certainly put to use for less critical HDR viewing already. However, these display devices don't quite get us to our desired 1000 nit baseline for professional HDR mastering, and they certainly haven't shown much promise for getting us beyond 1000 nits. Part of the challenge with these displays is they get us to higher luminance output by using a 4 subpixel structure that, in addition to the RGB subpixels, gives us a white subpixel. This additional white channel gives us the boost we need to get out of SDR luminance ranges, but with 4 significant shortcomings. First, even over a small area, the technology typically falls well short of 1000 nits. Most current versions of the technology operate with peak capabilities between 650 and 900 nits or so. Second, loading behavior on these displays is more significant than just about any other display alternative. The max luminance rating posted for such displays is often on as small of an area as 1% of screen. Third, WOLEDs are notoriously susceptible to burn-in when used for HDR, especially on static content like we are more likely to see in our own professional use reviewing and grading footage. And fourth, the innovative white, red, green, blue subpixel structure causes a very significant volumetric limitation in HDR use cases. This effectively means that in HDR, the available total color volume is much smaller than one might assume when just looking at the peak luminance rating. If you've been reading up on WOLED displays, you've no doubt heard this volumetric limitation mentioned, but it can be really kind of an esoteric topic to wrap one's head around. So let's give some concrete numerical examples from an actual WOLED panel that we have measured. Normally, a properly functioning 900 nit peak white display would give us just over 200 nits luminance for red, just over 620 for green, and just over 70 for blue. But in this real world measurement sample, red was only capable of 60 nits, not 200. Green was around 200 nits, not 620. And blue is around 30 nits, not 70. This is a very real limitation, especially for reference grade monitoring. And this volumetric collapse only gets worse as you try and cajole this technology into even higher nit output. Again, barring any significant advancements in the technology, it just doesn't have much promise for reference grade monitoring beyond 1000 nits. So given those considerations, we can, at least for the time being, rule out OLED as a means to getting us to the world of over 1000 nit monitoring, as it really is only marginally bringing us within shouting distance of even 1000 nit monitoring. The next technology to consider is LMCL, which stands for light modulating cell layer. You may often hear that referred to as dual layer or dual panel LCD. LMCL works by having all backlight elements on at full power, using essentially a standard RGB LCD panel up front, but sandwiched in between the backlight and front panel, an additional layer, the light modulating layer that gives the technology its name, is used. You can think of this layer as a monochromatic LCD, And the stacking of this with the standard LCD layer has a multiplicative effect that allows light to be blocked exceptionally well, giving us outstanding contrast ratios that, depending on the implementation, may range anywhere from 200,000 to 1 to, say, like about 1,000,000 to 1. The LCD-based technology, always on backlight, very high contrast, and pixel level control of light intensity means LMCL gives us OLED-like performance without the loading behavior or burning concerns of OLED, and without the halation concerns of local dimming. It is these characteristics that have made LMCL units like our own XM311K a frontrunner technology in that 1000 nit HDR space. However, this always fully powered backlight and two-layer implementation, which reduces light transmission efficiency, are precisely the same design elements that make this technology so difficult to scale beyond 1000 nits. LMCL requires more power and generates more heat than alternative systems, and these are technologically very difficult to deal with when attempting to go beyond 1000 nits. Beyond those engineering challenges, it is also important to note that the contrast ratio of such technology tends to stay the same fixed amount regardless of peak light output level. So what that means is that as the peak luminance level increases, the minimum black level also gets brighter, moving us further away from those OLED type black levels. The power and heat challenges are not necessarily insurmountable. But if we're serious about taking this technology beyond 1000 nits, um, those solutions tend to be tied to very expensive and often impractical fixes. Now, if monitoring is priced like a Rolls Royce, sounds like a jumbo jet, and generates heat like a bonfire is of interest to you, then we should definitely talk. But for everyone else, scaling this technology into the 3000 nit plus sphere is not particularly practical or cost effective. So again, barring some fairly significant enhancements or workarounds, this is not the technology to take us well beyond 1000 nits. Which brings us finally to full array local dimming, often called zone backlights. The world of display technology is certainly ever changing, but as of right now, the most practical and cost-effective way to pursue HDR monitoring beyond 1000 nits is full array local dimming. This technology is not without its challenges. Specifically, you're dealing with a physical limitation where you have less backlight zones than pixels. Getting the zoned backlight system to work successfully with the LCD front panel is the biggest hurdle in designing such systems, and that is essentially the catch when talking about going beyond 1000 nits currently. There are a couple of key areas that help to define how well a zoned backlight system will perform and differentiate the wide variety of full array local dimming systems out there. First is number of zones. Unsurprisingly, more zones usually means better performance. So for example, a 2000 zone system will typically have a performance advantage over a 500 zone system. Second is the actual algorithms that drive the backlight and LCD panel behavior. This is a critically important part of the puzzle. A system with 2000 plus zones should operate better than a system with just 500 zones. But if the algorithms don't work particularly well, that might not necessarily be the case. This is where we've personally spent a considerable amount of time and effort over the last few years. In March of this year, we actually rolled a significantly updated set of algorithms into our XM310K, which brought very meaningful performance gains to that monitor. So we know as well as anybody that hardware alone doesn't define what is possible on these systems. The algorithms are very important. The better the algorithms, the more accepted full array local dimming will become. Now, the question of whether to invest in LMCL or in full array local dimming, if you're not strictly interested in monitoring above 1000 nits, is definitely a tougher one. LMCL has some areas of performance benefit, such as avoiding halation. And this is part of the appeal of that technology and why we've offered both the LMCL 311K and the Zone Backlight 310K for some time now. However, LMCL tends to be more expensive, not that great off access, and requires more active and possibly noisy cooling with large fans. But aside from those points, the bigger question now is becoming increasingly whether the appeal of going beyond 1000 nits warrants giving up some of the mentioned benefits of 1000 nit limited LMCL and putting up with some of the complexities and limitations of brighter zoned backlight systems. Opinions are still very strongly split on this question, so I can only speak to the trend that we are actually seeing. The XM310K was released midway through 2018. despite this unprecedented pandemic we've all been going through, more 3000 nit XM310K have sold this year in 2020 than 2018 and 2019 combined. This is undoubtedly in part to due to some of the significant performance updates to the 310K in March. But in addition to that, the appetite for taking advantage of larger color volume monitoring is clearly growing as well. And at present, high quality zone backlight options like the 310K, which is as of today is still the brightest commercially available professional HDR monitor, are the way to tap into that world. All right, and that takes us to the end, and I am up for questions if we still have time for questions.
Wow, that was great. That was great. A lot of information, and in 20 minutes you did it.
Yeah. So Brian's sending me some questions. If there are other ones, maybe you want to raise your hand or feed them to Brian. But so one question was difference between large OLEDs and the pricing differences between large OLEDs and the 310, 311. Well, so the large OLEDs are definitely a lot less expensive, and part of that is just because of the consumer appeal. Obviously, if you're making something in the millions, which is what the LG panels are being made in, millions per year, your scales of economy there are great. Something like the panels that are used in the 310s and 311s, those are made in the tens of thousands at most per year. And that's part of the reason that technology is so darn expensive, because it is such a niche market. Have another question. Alexander Thomas asked about micro LED panels. Micro LED is a really cool technology, but unless you have a cool $1 million+ to spend and an 80-inch area or more, it's not very realistic yet. There's also some significant challenges with calibration of those units for common color spaces, but it is a very promising technology. Realistic, somewhat affordable micro LED for our industry in 24-inch and up sizes. I think you're probably still looking at a minimum of 5 years away. The technology is coming, but it's not here yet. Robbie asked if there is a magic number of zones at a screen size. So that's a really tough question. Part of it does come down to display size, but also obviously number of zones to number of pixels. So that ratio is important. But there is this kind of point of diminishing gains, right? And that's because of something called basically the eye's point spread function. So when you have a really bright dot against a dark background, even if there's some halation produced, that you'd have some halation that happens in your eye. If you think about looking at lights at night and whatnot, that localized contrast, your eye has a very hard time dealing with that anyway. So there is a point where obviously if you can go 1-to-1, that's great. But if you can't, the returns start to diminish. Once you go from 500 to 2000 is pretty significant. So there's a few common kind of zone count sizes. There's a lot of consumer technologies in the early days were like 128 zones. Then you had 500 something zones. Then you had some that were 1,000, some that were 2,000. And now you're starting to get to some systems that are 4,000 and plus. There is one interesting anecdote that I like to kind of tell people about, and that is that I have had a personal demo of a 16,000 zone system. But the algorithms used on that system were just hot garbage, and it looked worse than a 128 zone consumer technology. So that kind of again points to zone count alone is not the magic answer here. There have to be other considerations taken into account. Somebody asking specifically about another brand's monitor. I won't comment on that. So Jose asked, how do contrast play in different technologies? Direct correlation with peak lumens. Okay, so this is actually a great question. So Jose asked if how contrast ratios relate to the peak luminance of the unit, and with a zone backlight system, typically because you can turn the backlight essentially all the way off, As the peak luminance goes up, you do tend to have an actual measurable increase in contrast ratio. So a 4,000 nit zone backlight system will typically have a higher contrast ratio than a 1,000 nit system. But with something like your LMCL panels, as I mentioned, if you were to go to like 4,000 nits, your black level typically is actually going to come up because you are limited to a kind of a fixed contrast ratio in that technology.
We have many questions. That's nice.
Yeah. So Charles Poynton, who's one of my personal heroes. Hello, Charles.
Yeah.
Asked if is WLED sensible for consumer use owing to relatively good power performance. Yes, they are relatively power efficient, which is part of the appeal. When I first looked at light modulating cell layer panels, my initial reaction was this will be dead in the water for consumer technology because the form factor is all wrong and the power consumption is way too high. However, there have been recent improvements in the power efficiency, the transmission efficiency, which allows for these units to be more power efficient. I think a good kind of example within our own lineup is if we look at our 31-inch 3,000 nit zone backlight system, that draws about 200 watts, which is actually quite power efficient if anybody remembers looking at Dolby Pulsars with huge plugs and whatnot. But our 311K, even though it's a 1,000 nit unit, does draw 280 watts. So 80 watts more for 2,000 nits less. So it is definitely a much less power efficient technology because the backlight is always on. That being said, I think there's going to be, we've already kind of seen it with one brand in particular, but I think we'll see this as a potential trend in the future, is a combination of zone backlight and light modulating cell layer together. And by doing that, you can get high peaks, great local contrast, and most importantly for the consumer world, hopefully cut down on power consumption a bit. But it is a huge concern. HDR in general, that was my first, when people started talking about HDR monitors before we ever made one, my first kind of hard reaction was, but they killed the plasma over this. So it's it's definitely a very real concern, but it is getting better.
All right,
my friend,
so
we're gonna
Go ahead.
Yep. Get close here. Yeah, we want to give away stuff.
Yes, we have questions. Yes.
Well, we got a giveaway. Yeah, we got the questions going on, and I think what we're going to do this time, just to make it a little different,
yes,
we're going to throw the top 5 people into the wheel of names.
There you go.
It's not
That's
just
awesome.
about pure speed. I'm going to let them run the poll. I'll pull the top 5 names, and here right behind me, we've got the wheel of names right behind me right there, just waiting.